When the Red Chinese Army took over China, they began to destroy all the churches and profane all the sacraments. This is a true story. They arrived in this small provincial church in China and began to destroy it by pulling down its different statues and pictures, throwing things around, making a mess of everything. They took the ciborium out of the tabernacle and outside threw it on the ground. And all the hosts went all over the ground. They left then, after imprisoning the priest in a nearby building near where the hosts were profaned. He was not allowed to leave, he couldn't get out, and he was under surveillance. But there was a young girl from the parish who was very well catechized. Remember, this is before Vatican II. And when she saw what had happened to the Blessed Sacrament, she came and knelt. And of course, at the time, you couldn't touch the Blessed Sacrament. She bent over and with her tongue picked up one host. She received very religiously and went home. She continued this once every day because you were not allowed to receive communion twice. She was very well catechized. And she did this until the hosts were all gone except one. The priest in the prison was watching this and thanking God for such a heroic young girl. When she came for the last host, unfortunately, she made an unfortunate noise. The guards were aroused, they captured her, and they beat her to death with their rifles. I think of the devotion that inspired. I think of the great sense of the reality of the real presence of our blessed Lord in the tabernacle. You know, this gift was tremendous that the Lord had given us. And that story to me, when I heard it, says how beautiful it was and what bravery that young child had. Doing it according to the law of the church, and yet risking her life so that the Blessed Sacrament would be honored and would not be profaned. Today, we celebrate the Eucharist in a special way. It's what I call the second great condescension of God. The first was when God sought to become human. The God of all the universe chose to be one of us as a baby, growing up then, and becoming a man and dying on the cross for us. It was an amazing thing, but the Eucharist was the second condescension, that the Lord, the Master, Jesus himself, should become like food, like bread. You know, it was an act of genius, the Eucharist, because the Lord at the Last Supper had a heavy heart because he wanted to leave something special for his disciples before he went to his death. And he didn't leave a souvenir from his life or his cloak or anything like that. He left himself present in a form that seems almost incredible, that he became food for the people he loved. He was nurturance to them. You know, there's nothing closer to us than our food. In fact, sometimes it sticks to us more than we hope that it ever stuck to us. And sometimes we have around our stomach the food that we ate maybe 2 weeks ago. It's still there, but it's us now. It's no longer food. And so this tremendous intimacy that the Lord instilled in the Eucharist was his gift to his friends. This is the first of 3 gifts I'm going to be speaking about during these 3 days. Today, Good Friday, and at the Easter Vigil. 3 gifts that the Lord have given us. And I've titled this gift, the gift of humility. The gift in which God has given himself to us in his uniqueness. I'd also like to concentrate on each of these 3 days on a particularly important figure in the story of the passion and death of Jesus. Today I want to speak about St. Peter. Tomorrow on Good Friday, I'd like to speak about St. John, Jesus' best friend. And finally, at the Easter Vigil, I'd like to speak about Mary, his mother, who was present during these days. 3 figures, 3 gifts, and today we look at the gift of humility. And I want to look at Peter because he's one of my favorite characters in all the scriptures. He was opinionated, he was a man of action, he was impulsive, he was good-hearted, and often had his foot in his mouth. He was so thoroughly human that who couldn't be attracted to such a wonderful man? As the Jews would say, a real mensch. He was wrong so many times in the gospel. That's why I like him, because I find so much hope, having been wrong so many times in my life, to see the first pope be someone who was wrong so many times. He meets Jesus. What does he say? Go away from me, I'm a sinner. I could just see Jesus says, okay, Peter, don't worry about it. I'm here. Or when Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem and I know it's not going to be pretty, he rebukes Jesus. He says, don't talk like that. Let's go back to Galilee. And Jesus calls him Satan. You think like human beings do. You're not thinking like God. Poor Peter. Or when he says to the Lord, walking on the waters, call me, I want to walk on the water. And Jesus says, come on the water. And he does. He starts walking and sinking. As soon as he takes his eyes off of Jesus, he looks at his feet, and that was the end. Down he goes, and Jesus had to help him up and say, why did you falter? When he was meeting Jesus after the resurrection, he was in the boat. And it says in Scripture, he saw Jesus on the shoreline. He was so excited. He was fishing. He just had his loincloths and stuff on. So what does he do when he jumps in the water? He puts his clothes on first. Now, it's a little detail. He says, is that crazy? You're going to jump in the water, and before you jump in the water, you put on your clothes. Peter is amazing. And even after that, when he was in Rome during the persecution, he decides to leave Rome. And he's met by an angel of the Lord, which in Latin says to him, Quo vadis, which in Brooklynese means, where the heck do you think you're going? Get back to Rome. Even in his crucifixion, upside down. Peter was just this really interesting person who, even though he got so many things wrong, he got so many things right, he always bounced back. He was resilient. He always had hope. that no matter how many mistakes he made, God will be there for him. And then tonight, at the Last Supper, I'm sure he was completely thrown by the gift of the Eucharist. Take and eat, this is my body, this is my blood. Because the mood of the night was somber, was tense. They knew that there was a circle closing in on Jesus. Jesus himself told them, this is what's going to happen. And so there was like a terror at that time. So when Jesus started saying, this is my body, this is my blood, I would imagine the temperature started rising in that room, including Peter's. But that's not enough. Jesus had to show them something special. He said, I want them to get this, so I'm going to act it out. It's what we just did today in the washing of the feet. Now, you got to understand, no Jew would ever get on his knees and wash anybody else's feet. The only time they bend their knee is to God alone. That's all. And the slaves were the ones who were brought in to clean people's feet, because don't forget, very dusty, sandals. Did you ever walk around at the beach and you get sand in your shoes and sand in your sandals? It's very uncomfortable. You can't wait to get the hose. And well, so before every meal, everyone had their feet washed because they couldn't be comfortable without it. And so they always had slaves, servants there to do that before the meal. So Jesus tells the slaves, stop, don't do it. Gets up, takes his cloak off, and gets on his knees to wash feet, the work of a slave. Of course, who objects? Good old Peter. Peter is always there, always says the wrong thing, but his heart is in the right place. He says to the Lord, Lord, please don't let me do this. I don't want you bowing down before me, washing my feet. Please don't, please don't. And I can just imagine Jesus just throwing the sponge into the water and looking at Peter and saying, if you don't let me do this, then you can't be part of what I'm trying to build. And so what does Peter say? Great Peter. Then give me a shower. Give me a shower. Give me all the water you want. I want to be with you 100%. And so the washing of the feet began to show the direction of what God was trying to say all through the incarnation. It's that true spiritual growth, true development is not of augmentation, but of diminishment. That we grow in the spiritual life not by the more, but by the less. Not by grabbing and holding on and craving, but in letting go and living simply and living for God. It's true of every pathway, every tradition in the church. It's always one of diminishment. Think of the person who was called the second Christ, Francis. What does he do? In the middle of the buildup of the Renaissance in Italy, when people and banks were first formed, he gives up everything. Becomes il poverello, the poor man. He understood that it is in giving up that we grow. It is in becoming less that we become great. All of a sudden, all the words of the Lord make sense, right? Anyone who wants to be first needs to be last. Anyone who wants to be last. All these kind of almost confusing words of Jesus now suddenly fall into place. And there has never been anyone who has become a saint in the church who has not traveled this road of diminishment, this road of service. Even leaders are called upon to exert a servant leadership. in the church. And so this tremendous outpouring is a way of showing the difference between power and love. People that grab power, power, when it's expressed, it gets divided all of a sudden because other people want it. And it's taken away from you. And half goes here and half goes there. And people who clutch for power end up a lot of times with no power at all. But love is different. Love is different. The more you give it to others, the more you have. It doesn't diminish. So while the law of spiritual growth is one of diminishment, the law of love means that the more we give, the more we have. Remember the multiplication of the loaves and fishes? Do you know how many times that's in the Gospels? 6 times. In 2 of the Gospels, it's recorded twice. It made such an impression on them. And what is the multiplication of loaves and fishes? It's not about food. When the disciples thought it was about food, Jesus says, you don't get it, do you? It's not about bread. It's not about fish. The multiplication of the loaves means that when we give, everything gets multiplied. Love equals multiplication. If you don't want love, then keep it to yourself, and it will die in your heart. But if you go out of yourself in love, if you give your loaves and fishes to others, the Lord will multiply in a kind of strange mathematics that are only true in heaven, that the more you give, the more you get. And when you clutch and don't give, even what you have is taken away from you. Those 2 laws are the laws of humility. That's why I mean the gift of humility, the Eucharist, the washing of the feet, the words of Jesus, all point in the same direction. To be humble is the essence of the spiritual journey. And this is what the Lord taught even Peter. Unfortunately, there was another lesson for Peter that night. After all that Jesus said about loving your enemies, who draws a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane? Not James, not John, none of the apostles, but good old Peter. Why was he having a sword? We don't know. This was a pacifist group. But out comes the sword. And Jesus in the garden doesn't yell at the soldiers, doesn't yell at the chief priest, doesn't yell at Judas. He yells at Peter and says, Peter, put it away. Now, of course, I'm translating the beautiful scriptures into Brooklynese, We New Yorkers, we like the scriptures. We should write a New York version of the scriptures. Put it away. I taught you this. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And if that wasn't humility enough for Peter, later on, of course, he denies the Lord. And in Luke, it says, after he denies it, the Lord is brought out, and the Lord looks at him. That look must have been deadly to him. Talk about, realizing you just missed the boat. But Peter had to learn. And Jesus was a good teacher. Jesus is a good teacher with us. He teaches us in our lives. So, my brothers and sisters, the lesson of today, as Jesus said very clearly in John's Gospel, do you know why I did this to you? I want to give you a model. Wash each other's feet, which is short for live and love each other. Live for each other and love each other. It's difficult at times. Some of us are not easy to love. I was kidding with the foot people. By the way, the foot people you were excellent. You were wonderful. The foot people were great. But there are feet and there are feet. And some feet are, have been through life more. It's like human beings, you know. Some people are easy to like, some people are not easy to like. It's a struggle. But the Lord did not say like the people that like you or love the people that love you. He said, do you see that obnoxious person there? The person you can't stand? The person that's the person to love. Therese of Lisieux, there was one nun who would drive everybody nuts. Everybody in the convent couldn't stand her. Therese especially did everything for her, to the point where she said, "Why are you so nice to me?" And she said, "Because you're my sister." We have so much to learn, and it's all there. Jesus gave us an example. Let's not just think about it. Let's do it. May Jesus Christ be praised, both now and forever. Amen.